muted. Okay. Thanks to Eric and Candy, by the way. They're the victims of more new music than anybody deserves. But what happens in the planning process, that Compassion hymn is one of the new contemporary hymns by Keith and Kirsten Getty, and it's just powerful. And we couldn't do this Beatitude without that. So I downloaded the music and sent it to them. And so they've got to put all new, brand new song together for us this morning so that we could be blessed in that way. But they labor so faithfully, and I'm grateful. Are you? Yeah. In our study of the Beatitudes, we have considered the first four characteristics, which, as you know, if you've been with us, primarily concern our relationship toward God, our vertical relationship. But this morning we turn a corner and we begin to consider those qualities or characteristics that primarily concern our relationship toward others, that horizontal dimension. It's important to recognize, acknowledge that the first four are prerequisite to the second four, that unless the first four are true, in ever increasing measure, the second four will never be. We must first be poor in spirit, mourn, be meek, hunger and thirst for righteousness. And unless that is true, these four will never be true in their truest meaning and sense. The vertical always has priority, always. The reason that the 10 Commandments begin first with those commandments governing our relationship to God is that bears most directly and significantly upon our relationship to others. In summarizing the whole law, Jesus said, love the Lord your God with all of your heart and soul and mind and strength. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself, in that order. But Scripture never stops there with only the vertical. Half of the 10 Commandments concern our relationships to others, just as half of the Beatitudes concern our relationships with others as well. The horizontal dimension is second only to the vertical. The two greatest commandments, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, strength, love your neighbor as yourself. Unless our faith is deeply rooted in both our love for God and our love for others, it is incomplete at best. And yet our natural tendency is to view these things privately. We saw that last week in regard to righteousness. If you view righteousness only or primarily in terms of your personal relationship with God and not your relationship to others, let alone the wider community in the world, that is a distorted view of righteousness. Righteousness is all-encompassing, complete. In fact, as I've tried to show, each one of these Beatitudes has a profound impact on the way that we treat others. If we recognize and truly have had that work of grace in the depths of our heart, that we know that we are absolutely impoverished, bankrupt spiritually, that's going to impact the way that we view those in not only spiritual need, but material need as well. In fact, the fourth Beatitude, that we hunger and thirst for righteousness, is in many ways transitional between the two, because it addresses both directly, both this relationship and this relationship as well. But now we come specifically to those focused on our relationships to others, which brings us to the fifth Beatitude in Matthew chapter 5, verse 7. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall be shown mercy. That is the foundational characteristic of our relationship to others. mercy. It is not grace. It's not peace. It's not even forgiveness. It is mercy. In fact, grace and forgiveness are neither one mentioned in any of the Beatitudes. Jesus will have a lot to say about forgiveness throughout the book of Matthew and in the Sermon on the Mount later on, but it's not part of the foundation of those 8 Beatitudes. Which brings the question, what exactly is mercy? What is the relationship of grace and mercy? How are they different and distinct from one another? And what is the relationship of mercy to forgiveness, which is also very important, just not foundational like mercy is? Well, let me begin with the simplest definition of mercy. Mercy is helping those in misery. That's the root of the word. That's the root context of the word. Mercy is helping those in misery. This is a little fuller definition. Mercy is compassion and compassionate response specifically to those in need. Let me give you just one more fuller definition still. This is from the International Standard Bible Encyclopedia, one of the great works. The deep, tender feeling of compassion that is awakened by the trouble, weakness, suffering, or vulnerability of another in need of help. Mercy always has that sense of someone in great difficulty, in need of help, and the compassion that arouses, the deep compassion. Mercy is an emotion, but it is never merely an emotion. It always responds. It always takes action to need with help. Mercy is always demonstrated. Let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence so that we may receive mercy to help us in our time of need. Mercy is both compassion and help. That's what makes it distinct from pity. We can feel for somebody, we can feel empathy for somebody. Mercy feels deep compassion, and it responds to that aroused compassion with help. That is how mercy is distinctly different from grace. Richard Lenski, in his commentary on the Sermon on the Mount, writes this: mercy always deals with what we see of pain, misery, and distress, that is the results of sin. Grace always deals with sin and guilt itself. Mercy extends relief for the consequences. Grace extends pardon. Mercy cures, heals, helps. Grace cleanses and reinstates. Which is what was clearly demonstrated in the well-known parable of the Good Samaritan. The Samaritan coming upon the man who had been robbed and beaten, a stranger, complete stranger to him, an ethnicity not usually associated with. He was moved with compassion, that's what the text tells us, and gave him the help that no one else would give him. At the end of the story, when Jesus turns to the wily attorney who was trying to weasel his way out of the command, Jesus looks at him and said, simply ask him who was the neighbor to him. To which he replied, the one who had mercy on him. In other words, the one who helped him. Mercy is always an action, always a personal response to the need. That is the very essence of God's nature. It is the essence of his nature. Moses declared to the people of Israel, "For the Lord your God is a merciful God." Deuteronomy 4:31. Where did Moses learn that? When God passed before Moses on Mount Sinai in the giving of the second set of tablets, the Lord himself proclaimed out of the cloud to Moses, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious. The psalmist declared, our God is merciful. The prophet Jeremiah declared, the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never end, never come to an end. The Lord is full of compassion and mercy, wrote the Apostle James. It is the essence of his nature and being to be both moved by need and to help those in need. You can't be deeply moved and have the capacity or ability to help and not help. He has a deep, tender compassion for those in trouble, weakness, suffering, or vulnerability, those in need of help. That's who he is. That's who God is. Mercy isn't simply what he does on occasion. It's who he is. The Lord, merciful and gracious. Mercy is the foundation of his graciousness. He extends grace to us because we are so in need of grace and because he's moved by compassion to do so. He forgives because we are so in need of forgiveness. He's moved by our plight, by our trouble, and helps us in our need. God is an ever-present help in trouble. Psalm 46:1. God isn't bothered by our cries for help. He isn't inconvenienced by our pleas for mercy. He's moved by our cries for help and our pleas for mercy. It's interesting in studying the Psalms that the first sentence of the first prayer in the Psalms, because understand that Psalm 1 and 2 are not prayers, they are the foundation to the Psalms, Psalm 1 and 2. The first prayer is Psalm 3, and the first sentence, the first line of the first prayer is this: Lord, how many are my foes? The first line of the first prayer, a personal, direct, urgent cry for help. Prayer is the language of the people who are in trouble and know it and who believe that God can get them out of it. Eugene Peterson. Isaac Bashevis Singer once said, I only pray when I'm in trouble, but But I'm in trouble all the time, so I pray all the time, he said. It's God's nature. It's why Christ came. We were in trouble, and God came to rescue us from that trouble. For this reason, he had to be made like them, fully human in every way, in order that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in service to God, and that he might make atonement for the sins of the people. He was moved by our plight, and he came to help in the only way that we could be helped. That's mercy. That's who he is. Now, it should come as no surprise to us, since that is who he is, the essence of his nature. That's what we, his people, should be. How could it possibly be any other way? It's important to note exactly what Jesus is saying in that particular beatitude. Blessed are the merciful. Not blessed are those who engage in acts of mercy. Blessed are the merciful. That is the adjective for mercy. It is only used twice as an adjective in the whole of the New Testament. Only twice. And the only other time is in Hebrews 2:17 in reference to Jesus as our merciful, adjective, high priest. And now here in reference to us from Jesus himself. And here's the significance of that adjective. It isn't describing what we do, though you can't be merciful without doing. It is describing what we are. What we are. It is describing a disposition, a characteristic, a heart, a mentality. That's why it's so important, Padmini, that we study each and every beatitude. So easy to just breeze over them in a reading, isn't it? Because they're so simple and so concise, and because there's a cadence and a rhythm of beauty. Easy to read through them without stopping to really think, what is righteousness? What does it mean to hunger and thirst for righteousness? What is mercy? Why and how is that so foundational to all of our relationships? Why the adjective? It is describing a disposition. God doesn't simply do occasional acts of mercy, like some reigning king who wakes up one day and says, you know what? I think I'll do something nice for the people today. We'll just make it a nice day. That's not him. His whole being and nature is to be aroused by need to compassion and help, so that we might find help in our time of need. Anyone is entirely capable of occasional acts of mercy. Anybody can do that. Even significant acts of mercy. Those who do not know or even acknowledge who God is are capable of showing mercy. But to be merciful, to be deeply touched by the misery of others so as to be moved to responsive help, without exception, that's divine. That's a work of God's grace in the depths of the human heart, to have that disposition, that heart and mind and characteristic and life and lifestyle. That's a work of God. for it to be not simply what we occasionally do, but what we are. That's a change that only he can make. I just think it's so telling that it was one of the first and most notable results of God's work following Pentecost. The people were changed. Their hearts and minds and dispositions were changed. And so we're told they sold their property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. They could no longer be indifferent to that or unmoved by that. There was no needy person among them. From time to time, those who owned land or houses sold them and brought the money from the sale and laid it at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed to anyone who had need. They organized a daily distribution for the widows, which was a major operation, a major operation. Their hearts were moved by need and moved to respond to that need. It's who they were. It's who they were. Later, the Philippians, deeply moved by the needs of the profound needs of the Jerusalem believers in the midst of their own, quote, very severe trial and extreme poverty, in overflowing joy and enriched generosity, gave as much as they were able and beyond their ability. And Paul says, not because we asked them to. Their hearts were moved by the need and moved to respond. At the end of time, Jesus tells us later in Matthew that he calls the righteous to enter their reward, the kingdom of heaven. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, an alien, and you invited me in. I needed clothes. You clothed me. I was ill. You looked after me. I was in prison. You came to visit me. To which their response is, when did we see you? They weren't doing it to be credited or recognized or even seen. They weren't thinking about themselves or what they had done. It was simply who they were. That's kingdom living. That's the future rule and reign of God invading the present. His nature in the nature of his people. That's the foundation of kingdom living in terms of others. That same nature. But it is neither automatic nor permanent. We can quickly and easily drift from it. We can. That's why we need the scriptures to train, to rebuke, to correct. I need that. You need that. We need it constantly and we need it continually, or we drift. The fact that it is neither automatic nor permanent is clearly borne out in the testimony of the letter of James. It's just starkest testimony to that fact. The Christian believers to whom James wrote could adequately or accurately be described as mercy challenged, specifically. Merciful was not their reputation. The poor and needy and misery were not what moved their heart. Rather, the comfort and convenience of their own gatherings, where the poor and needy were discriminated, told to sit on the floor in the back, where needs were not helped, but rather met by the shallow offers of prayers and best wishes. Go, be fed, be well. Meticulous in their Christian practices, meticulous in their orthodox beliefs, meticulous in their routines, in all of their Christian doings, but devoid of mercy. How could that be? And so James the Apostle writes, judgment without mercy will be shown to anyone who has not been merciful. Mercy triumphs over judgment. And then again, the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit. Religion that God the Father accepts as pure and faultless is this: to look after orphans and widows in their distress. That is always the component of mercy. People in difficult places. It does not matter how meticulous our Christian Orthodox belief, that's important. But it does not matter how meticulous our Christian belief, practice, and behavior are if we are indifferent to those in trouble or need. Just after Jesus called Matthew to follow him, Matthew threw a big dinner at his home and invited all of his cruddy buddies, his fellow tax collectors and sinners, and the Pharisees were indignant. It was an assault on their clean, respectable, comfortable, predictable, appointed world that they had worked so hard to meticulously construct for themselves. It was rocking all of that. There were nobody more meticulous in their beliefs and practices and behaviors than the Pharisees, and Jesus' response was twofold. Number one, it's not the healthy who need a doctor. Not why I came. And then he said this to them: go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. All of the meticulousness of our beliefs and practices and behaviors and routines mean nothing compared to mercy, because that's who God is. It's who he is. Sin can be oh so deceitful. Oh, so deceitful. That's why we need that sword of the Spirit, that scalpel, and the Holy Spirit. Let me give you just one example. The principle of self-determination and personal responsibility are important They're important to our humanity. They're important to our nature as beings created in the image of God. But they can easily become a convenient excuse for us to turn a blind eye to need. They can become a convenient excuse for us to turn a blind eye to need. Because people are responsible for the consequences of their decisions, therefore I have no responsibility for the consequences of those decisions, even if those consequences of those decisions put them in a state of misery. People make their choices. Not my problem. Not my concern. Let me ask you, what if that were God's response? What if that were his response? Let me just read a couple of portions from the 107th Psalm. Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His love endures forever. Let the redeemed of the Lord tell their story. Those he redeemed from the hand of the foe. Remember Psalm 3:1. Those he gathered lands from the east and the west and the north and the south. Some wandered in desert wastelands, finding no way to a city where they could settle. They were hungry and they were thirsty, and their lives ebbed away. They cried out to the Lord in their trouble, and he delivered them from their distress. Some sat in darkness and utter darkness, prisoners, suffering in iron chains. Why? Well, I think our minds often tell us, well, the innocent who suffer, that's one thing, but those who suffer for what they've done, that's personal responsibility. Listen to these words. Some sat in darkness and utter darkness, prisoners suffering in iron chains. Why? Because they rebelled against God's commands and despised the plans of the Most High. So he subjected them to bitter labor. They stumbled and there was no one to help. But then they cried to the Lord in their trouble, and he saved them from their distress. That word again. He brought them out of darkness, the utter darkness. He broke away their chains. Let them give thanks to the Lord for his unfailing love. Some became fools through their rebellious ways, suffered affliction because of their iniquities. They loathed all food and drew near the gates of death. Then they cried to the Lord in their trouble, and he saved them from their distress. He sent out his word and healed them and rescued them from the grave. I could read on and on through that great psalm. What if God left you and me to our decisions and responsibilities? Where would we be? Which brings us to the promise. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Not quid pro quo. That's how, in just a quick surface reading of the Beatitudes, we might take it. Do acts of mercy so that when it comes time that you need, so you've got some things banked. That's not what it means. Remember the inevitable result. That's what those blessings are to every beatitude. You can't be merciful, adjective, unless you've received mercy. So if you have received mercy, and as a result, you're merciful, you will receive mercy. You all know the well-known parable in Matthew 18 of the steward who owed a amount of money that he couldn't pay back in 100 lifetimes. And the master, in his compassion, had mercy on him in his misery and forgave him. And in that parable, that servant went to a fellow servant who owed him a minuscule amount in comparison and demanded that he pay. He was not merciful. Though he had been forgiven, he had not received mercy. And he would not receive mercy. That's the nature of the kingdom. But if you are merciful, because God has done a work of grace in your heart, and you realize how utterly indebted you were to him and what he extended to you, nobody is an inconvenience or a bother or a trouble to your well-planned world. That's not your nature. It's not who you are. It's who he is, and it's who he intends us to be. Let's pray.